Come on.
God, I've done this so many times, started to talk, but I'm muted. Well, you know what I say when I come on, so you don't really need my voice. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Red May, your 1-month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, 110 speakers. Wow. We're down to our last 3 events, including tonight. So before we go into theory of the gimmick, I want to preview the last 2 that are coming on Tuesday and Wednesday. They're very unusual in that they don't conform to the Red May template. First one, the broadcast of a secret broadcast that was recorded in the middle of the night at 3 or 4 in the morning and broadcast over the world, but Americans didn't tune in because, well, it was 3 or 4 in the morning, or 5 or 6, depending on where you are. It's neither vertical nor horizontal, about Rodrigo Nunez's new book. It has Richard Seymour, a couple of other people in it, and I have no idea when it's on. This thing is clandestine to the nth degree. So it's super hip. It's like a zine that only a few people know about. So check it out. You'll find out all the info for that. And then on Wednesday at 3 p.m., we have our only live event of this year's Red May on the George Floyd uprising. It's in Mossman Park in the Bay Area with Wendy Trevino, Shimon Salem, Idris Robinson, and Joy James in conversation. I'm not sure whether she's going to be in the park or she'll be coming online from somewhere, but I do know the time for that one. It's 3 p.m. And that will be the end of this year's Red May, our fifth annual Red May. This is pretty amazing. You know, the most businesses in America don't last 5 years. Well, with the lack of any economic logic at all, we have somehow lasted for 5 years. We'd like to do another 5, but that depends on you. So give to us. We do not have any institutional funding. A festival with a slogan like "Be a Commie for a month" doesn't find institutional funding in America. How can you give to us? You go to www.redmayseattle.org and click the donate button. It'll take you either to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, or to our Patreon. You can be a patron, very 18th century thing to be, at a $3 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month, or $20 a month level. So there you go. You want more Red May? Be kind, like Blanche Dubois. Or no, Blanche is the recipient. We're Blanche Dubois. You're the stranger who gives the money. So go do that by card or whatever. But enough of me chattering. Let us get to theory of the gimmick, aesthetic judgment, and capitalist form. This is, of course, the name of a book by Sianne Ngai. It's, I don't know, we could call it the 3rd book in a loose trilogy, which kind of redefines the aesthetics and the objects of aesthetics. We've always thought it was about the beautiful and, you know, all those grandiose terms that one learned. Well, it happens to be about things like cute, zany, interesting, and even gimmicks. The nice thing too is this wonderful book is informed by a totally up to the moment acquaintance and reading with all things that are being done in the vital readings of Marx all over the world, which is very unusual. So there are a lot of reasons to like it, and I'm sure we will get into it when we have our moderator, Christopher Nealon, who is at Johns Hopkins and is the author of 4 books of poetry. My favorite being Heteronomy, but the latest book of poetry is up for a is it National Book Award, Chris? There's a Pulitzer? What is it? I mean, it's up for something. Anyway,
it was for the National Book Critics Circle Award.
National Book Critics Circle. What's the name?
Yes.
What's the name of the book? So the people.
It's called The Shore.
The Shore. Okay, and he's also the author of The Matter of Poetry, which is a book of criticism about American poetry in the 50s and 60s, and how, despite its apparent apolitical front, you can actually read the whole history of what's going on with the working class and capitalism at the time. So wonderful stuff. And a new anthology, which you will remember was discussed on the first day of Red May, and you can find on Red May TV. It's with Colleen Lai. Give me the complete title of that again.
It's part of a series where everything is after something. And this is after Marx, literature and value in the 21st century, I think is the subtitle.
Okay, literature and value in the 21st century after Marx. So I turn it over to you, Chris, and welcome to Red May, Chris and Sianne.
Thank you, Philip. I really enjoyed talking with all the folks who are online with us among the contributors of After Marx way at the beginning of May. But I've also all month long been looking forward to this conversation with you, Sianne. We were just talking before the call went live about how I had an opportunity to read the book fairly early on in its life, and it was so exciting to read, and it has been really great to see it getting a lot of attention out in the world since it was published. It came out in like August, September. Is that right? Maybe
like late June of.
Oh, geez. Okay, sorry. Well, so almost a year now, and we were thinking that it might be nice for you to kick us off with just like your own favorite brief description of the book's kind of orbit, maybe how you ended up shaping it the way you did, and then I thought I would respond to that with just a few questions about some of the theoretical interventions, and then see where it takes us in our conversation. We've got really great participants here on the Zoom call to get us started with a Q&A afterwards as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's just really great to be doing this with you. I'm really grateful to you for taking the time and being such a great reader of the book. So this book is about an aesthetic category, which is something I've written on before. And for me, an aesthetic category is a double-sided thing. It's basically the connection between a perception of form, and by form, I mean socially pre-shaped perception, actually. That's a bit tautological, I know, but the perception of form conjoined with an evaluation, an aesthetic judgment. And it's the way these two things come together and are sort of sutured together by a spontaneous feeling. That's all it's grounded in, right? But the gimmick is particularly interesting to me because one of the arguments of the book is that it's a distinctively capitalist aesthetic category that really comes into its own with only mature, which is to say crisis-prone capitalism. And one of my main kind of models for thinking about the gimmick throughout the book is something almost like the Rube Goldberg invention, which is these cartoons that he made for almost the entire 20th century, a really long career. And before he started cartooning, he was a mining engineer and a vaudevillian briefly. But these are, the Rube Goldberg is, American slang now for an elaborate contraption that is usually designed, and this is the reason why it's funny, to do a really kind of basic task, right? But it involves all these bells and whistles and moving parts. And one of the interesting things about the Rube Goldberg machine is when people remember it and, just the popular cultural imagination, we remember the buckets and the combs and the iron that falls down. But people actually forget that these machines contain small creatures, mostly animals, but sometimes small people. So they're kind of an allegory of basically the concatenation of, let's say, dead labor, commodities and living labor that is necessary for the production of capital. So I feel like Goldberg was in some ways meditating on this, this form in all of these cartoons. So basically what a gimmick is, it's when we call something a gimmick, we are basically expressing suspicion about something that is making an extravagant claim to value that we feel like is inflated or false. So it's really a judgment about value, and not so much about value, but about a claim to value. And so, for people at this conference, for a Marxist thinker, this, I think, insight already is exciting, right? But all the more so when you think about one of the many forms that the gimmick can take, which is a labor-saving device, a purportedly labor-saving device, right? And one of the things about the gimmick, when we perceive something as a gimmick, we can talk more about when we do and when we don't, because it's a very unstable form. But one of the things that we detect or we say when we find something, judge something to be a gimmick, is that the thing seems to be either working too hard or working too little. So it seems to be encoding either too much labor or not enough, right? And gimmicks also have a problematic relationship to time. I guess the best illustration of this is, the outdated special effect, right? Something that seemed kind of spectacular in cinema in a certain year, decades later, just looks very tired and unconvincing aesthetically. But also an example like Google Glass, right, which is this, this product that was put on the market in 2012, initially as a fashion accessory, and completely flopped when it was sold that way. But since then has quietly kind of re-entered the economy quite successfully in the form of a tool used in warehouses and factories, where workers have to process a lot of information coming in quickly and have both of their hands free. So it was a gimmick back then, and now not so much, even though it's no longer called Google Glass. I think it's just called Glass. But this illustrates also the kind of instability of this form. So if you think about like the variables that are involved here, the gimmick says something about value. It says something about labor, or it indexes a kind of misgiving we have about the amount of labor that the thing is somehow embodying, and also time. And of course, labor, time, and value are metrics that become inextricably linked in the valorization of capital. So that's the argument the book makes about about why this aesthetic form is specific to this to the society that we live in.
Thank you. Yeah, hearing you put it that way reminds me of some of my favorite passages and observations in the book, which I'm sure some of them we'll get to be able to talk about in the next hour. I was also thinking about something that Philip said early on about this being like a trilogy of books. So your book, Ugly Feelings, which is followed by Our Aesthetic Categories, feels in some way like, those books were leading to this book. And I partly experienced the gimmick as a category, but I also experience it as a form that might include or generate those other categories, like so that one could have a response to the zaniness of a particular gimmick, or feel that emotion oneself while experiencing a certain kind of gimmickal activity. So there's something that feels in some ways to me, Sianne, like this book is not only the third and kind of like a series of 3 books, but also in some ways like the culmination or like the climax of that, because I think there's something portable about the gimmick as a form that retroactively helps me rethink the other work that you were doing. So that's one of the things I find really exciting about this book, not only in terms of its portability to your earlier work, but for all of us who are interested in coming up with fresh ways of thinking about art and culture and the technical aspects of the production and the reception of art and culture, the carefulness with which you think about value production, and the ways that you do think about the instabilities of time and labor that go into the valuation of an object, both as a capitalist object and one that will suffer aesthetic judgment. I think that's really different than earlier forms of Marxist criticism. And one of the things I'd like to talk about today, if we can, is the ways in which I think your work both takes some of the what for me became weaknesses in Frankfurt School thinking and turns them into strengths. I think that's something really special that you do. When I think about like who's taking Frankfurt style work and bringing it into the 21st century, it's really your work for me that does that most excitingly. But I'd also like to think about how different your version of Marxist literary and cultural criticism actually is from a lot of what came before it. To me, that has to do with things about how, like the sublime isn't as big a category for you, for instance, as it would be for all the many folks who learned so much from the Marxist literary criticism of somebody like Frederick Jameson. So there's lots we could talk about in the next little while, but I wondered if I could read something that I've always found really suggestive and generative from towards the end of the book, and just ask you to zoom in on it a little bit based on what you've just said. So I found these sentences are really a great kind of summary of something about your book that I really love, which is it's interested, I think you used the word a minute ago, in our vernacular practices of making judgments. I think that's really special. And so here it's like 2 or 3 sentences, and I wonder if we could just talk about them for a minute or two. So this is what you write towards the end of the book. Against the grain, then, of widespread academic belief in the obsolescence of labor and value discourse, which I take you to be saying kind of politely, like a belief in the obsolescence of Marxist criticism, whether attributed to the rise of so-called biopower or science or the internet or finance, against the grain of those things, the vernacular gimmick strikingly reveals this discourse of labor and value to be alive and kicking in the realm of aesthetics. And as an aesthetic judgment in particular, the gimmick is a way in which people possess or process the qualitative sociological effects of the innermost contradictions of capitalism's law of value in everyday conversations about displeasure and pleasure. I love those sentences so much, partly because they are a little Gramscian to my ear. Like everybody actually is a kind of Marxist literary critic. They just don't know. And there are some words in here, like vernacular and everyday that I would love to hear you talk about some more. And maybe if you would care to dilate just a little bit on that, also that difference that you describe, like again, how it's against the grain of certain other discourses. So I don't know, is that of interest to you to think about that?
Yeah, totally. No, thanks, Chris. I'm really glad. It just feels so good to be read by Chris and everybody, I have to say. Anyway, so what I like, what was satisfying working on this really surprisingly complex, actually interesting aesthetic category is just there is a certain optimism to it in that the judgment of the gimmick is so ordinary. And for me, yes, it really is like testifying to the fact that, people, without necessarily even being super conscious about it, grasp the system they live in, without reading Marx necessarily even, although that's lots of fun and we should all do it because it's super enjoyable. And but without opening an economic textbook, but simply by paying rent, earning wages, and working a job, or having a bank account, we're all enmeshed in the system. And insofar as we understand something about it. And I think the gimmick registers that understanding of the way these things come together, and that is kind of I do like a populist streak, I think, and I find that very heartening actually, and it shows how a certain kind of critique happens in people's everyday evaluations, including this evaluation, which happens at the aesthetic level. I mean, like, make no mistake, it's always only an aesthetic response, right? It's a response to an aesthetic object. And of course, the aesthetic object doesn't have to be an artwork. It can be, one can have an aesthetic response to pretty much anything, right? So it could be a kitchen gadget or a foam in a restaurant or even a financial strategy, right? But what's unique about this aesthetic response is that it's one of the few I can think of that really directly indexes the economic in this direct way, and it comes across also in the way that we think of gimmicks as cheap. That is an explicitly economic word. Cheap, overrated, overvalued. Those are the words that we reach for when we are trying to describe, gimmicks to other people, or why we think a certain thing is a gimmick. So there is a kind of like a interesting indirect diagnosis of, the kind of evaluation and valuation of things that takes place in our economic lives, but that's happening at an aesthetic level. So I guess that's one that populist streak does maybe distinguish the work I do from an older Frankfurt School approach, although there's plenty of populist streaks and that stuff too, actually. So I actually feel more of a continuity sometimes than a difference. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, there's this great quotation by Adorno, which I sometimes like just pull up before I do anything, because it's very, it's one I've taken to heart, which is, he says, like, when you're thinking dialectically, you can always start anywhere, you know what I mean? And that sometimes starting in because you'll end up in the same place, but so you can start with like the most obscure phenomenon, and that sometimes starting in that kind of place, that it's liberating, that actually different kinds of categories will enable you to think about the system in a way that others don't, either because the pathway is just too thin, or it's, or just the whole thing comes alive when you start from a different place in that cultural system, and I really believe that's true.
Yeah, I do feel like that is a continuity between, Adorno reading the horoscope columns in the papers in LA, like really owning up to, or really owning being able to start anywhere, partly because of belief in capitalist totality. Like, it's all going to lead you sooner or later to these basic questions of value production. And so that affords a certain critical freedom that I think you share. And so that to me is a real interesting continuity. And then there's maybe, a temperamental, or I don't know what to attribute the difference to, but you can read Adorno, especially Adorno and Horkheimer, kind of lamenting how stupid the average person's had to become. But you're doing something else in this book, which is like asking us to remember how canny people can be. That, I think that difference matters. It doesn't mean that you're making some opposite argument, but it is an important inflectional difference to have a little bit of faith. That's why I said it felt a little Gramscian at times to me. Could you, the second half of the book is kind of organized around we could call them case studies, like things that captured your imagination in that way, where you did start anywhere, and they are an interesting splay of stuff. So there's a chapter on Henry James. There's a chapter on the poetry of Rob Halperin, an art film that reworks Suspiria by Stan Douglas, photographs by a Norwegian photographer, Torbjørn Rudland, like a really interesting splay of cases in which gimmickry, or the gimmick, expresses itself in different ways. And again, for people who are interested in diving deeper into this book, who maybe have just started it, or who want to know more about some of its, like where your attention takes you, I wonder if you could talk about what for you made those your cases, like what excited your imagination, and whether putting them together as you were finalizing the shape of the book helped you see the different ways a gimmick could be experienced or even deployed by producers of these objects.
Yeah. So yeah, one of the challenges of working on a topic like this, it's one of the pleasures, but one of the challenges is the question of the archive. And it's a very different sort of archival problem than one normally has, where there's like not enough material. There's just too much. There are too many places to start from. I mean, so how do you choose? I mean, one could analyze this experience slash judgment anywhere, given that the form is ubiquitous and lurking, essentially, lurking in everything made in capitalism. That's what makes it sort of different and not just like a fourth aesthetic category that was sort of that belonged with the other three. And actually, Chris, when you and I were like the stuff that you've said to me has actually made me really see this, right? It's like if acute was about, managing our relationship to commodities and about consumption in some ways, like this desire that, we have this fantasy that we actually have power over these things that clearly have power over us. That's what cuteness is all about in that other book. If the zany is about production, in that it's about this kind of uncomfortable intersection between work and what looks like play. The interesting is about the circulation of information and discourse. The gimmick, is sort of about the valorization process that brings all of these other activities together, right? And links them all together. And so therefore, yeah, like you said earlier, it's kind of more of like a deep structure that underpins not just those other two categories, but underpins anything. It's just latent in anything that is a capitalist commodity, which is pretty much everything. Not everything, but many things, right? So the problem with the archive is like, okay, so what do I pick? Like, what's and it was, I had the same problem with the other book too, for example, you could, really talk about cuteness only talking about the history of the stuffed animal, which is actually quite interesting. The history of the stuffed animal, so what I tried to do was, in this book in particular, I tried to pick examples, representations of the gimmick that I also felt were meditations on it in some ways. And meditations on the form, not necessarily even without having the word for the form or using the word, but clearly Helen DeWitt's magnificent novel, The Lightning Rods, is a meditation on the gimmick. I don't think she uses the word, but that's clearly what that it's one of the best novels I've read in the last decade is about. So then I was gravitating towards artists who I felt like were taking on the risk, and it is a real risk, of in their effort to kind of understand what this form is and to kind of like press out its various social meanings in the making of art, right? Not sociology, but art, took on the risk of using it, like really using it, and it's risky because I think all of the case studies, maybe less so with Rob Halperin actually. I think I chose Music for Porn as a book to help me think through some of the complexities of Marx's value form theory, is because Rob Halperin is already literally doing that, like in that book. It's a book about sex with soldiers, with dead soldiers, even. But that is routed through also a kind of thinking through what it is, what kind of work it is that a soldier does, right? The kind of labor that a soldier does, and but with the other books, the Stan Douglas piece. So it's my favorite Stan Douglas piece, and it's like you said, it's a film installation, and it's kind of automated. So it runs. There's some algorithm and a machine that basically pairs together different images and sounds and maps them on top of each other. And what drew me about to this particular Stan Douglas piece is it was pretty much the only Stan Douglas piece that kind of got a slightly negative review, because Stan Douglas, everybody loves his work, and I think he hits a spot that is like that is kind of like, I love his work, but I like this piece a lot. And the piece looks basically like sort of bad Technicolor. So it's like it's about the special effect, but the piece is also about exchange. It's a kind of the content is all these little bits and pieces of Grimm's fairy tales that all involve bargaining, exchange, whether it's like a turnip for a pig or some thalers for a day of wages. So anyway, but Stan Douglas really risks, I think, making his work look kind of bad in order to make this piece. The photographer, Turpin Redland, is probably the artist in the book who most kind of flirts with the Gimmick Is form. All of his pictures are very commercial looking. They often have like a sexual joke in them. They sometimes look like slightly like sleazy fashion photography. So he's doing something with that, and there's a kind of like recursion of a particular kind of image that to me was interesting as well. And I'll just say this because I know that this is kind of a literary thing, and so I'm just going to geek out for a second and say the James chapter, I have to say, I was really proud of that one because it's kind of just a reading of all of Henry James and pointing out this.
It's amazing.
Funny, what's that?
It's amazing.
Thanks. I mean, it took 20 years basically to write. I mean, I knew I was obsessed with James, and I knew I was obsessed with a couple plot motifs that recur over and over again, where he is constantly describing it's sometimes men, it's mostly women who have to repair something that's wrong in the social fabric, usually involving adultery, and they have to do so secretly. And the work is described, it's basically emotional labor, and it's very exhausting, but they have to hide it. They have to, it has to be occulted. So they have to, part of the labor and part of why it's so intensive is they have to do this extra work of concealing the fact that they're doing this work. And meanwhile, and this funny tick of how these characters, who are all helper characters in some ways, constantly describe their labor in terms of wage labor. So they're all aristocrats, but most of them are. But the aristocrats who are doing this labor, who are mostly women, are constantly comparing themselves to waged workers. But meanwhile, James also has lots of has many like longer stories and some novels about working women and men who are employed as butlers or nannies, governesses, so these are waged employees who conceive of their work as kind of the donated work of an unwaged, wife. So there's this kind of cross-like pattern that's happening, where the unwaged are imagining themselves as almost like performing the freely donated work of a family member, and meanwhile the family members, the wives, are conceiving of their work in terms of waged work. So the whole thing, so why does this come up with the gimmick? Because every time this pattern happens, gimmicks sprout up all over James's writing. And one of the funnest things about writing this chapter is I could finally say, look, you guys, yes, James is like the writer of these amazing abstract sentences. He's the master of indirection. But there's some real, how do I put this? It's also a writing full of terrible metaphors, just really bad, that then kind of get played out for pages, There's a constant use of really fancy vocabulary, philosophical vocabulary, words like phenomenon and essence to describe super trivial things like a dinner party. This is constant like imbalance between vocabulary that belongs to like one register to use for another register. And so the work is in some ways just saturated with this form in a way that is linked to, I argue, this kind of thinking he's doing about secret labor, which I ultimately think, sorry, I'll stop talking, I'll just finish this thought, but like, which I ultimately think is a reflection on what we might call the structurally occulted labor of unwaged labor of, late 19th century women, and how that is disguised and concealed and combined with the waged, right? So the wage ends up hiding the non-waged. And that relationship between the waged and the non-waged, between work and non-work, is really the core of the capitalist gimmick, right? Which is pointing like an arrow to the way in which the valorization of value that is capital produces a kind of throwing off constantly of jobs, right? Just to put it bluntly. So I think the gimmick can actually contain all this, but it took I wanted to really indulge myself and let these readings kind of do a lot of the work of showing, just how much the form, how much content is in this form.
I love that. And I think it's interesting to think about James, of all people, as wanting to pursue his intuitions in this regard. The way you describe that chapter in particular makes me, I'm going to try out something. I'm going to see if I can be clear about it, because I think there's something important about what you're doing differently than some of the ways we got used to thinking about what it means to do Marxist readings of texts. And so I want to take an example and say that, like, a postmodernization thesis, say in its clearest formulations by like a Perry Anderson, who uses words like de-differentiation, to talk about like so-called high culture and low culture, or high culture and mass culture, sort of mixing and mingling. And that's the name of the game in our era. And you index that maybe to productive capacities. There's just so many objects, that of course, sooner or later, a certain kind of mixing and mingling will occur. Now, that's downstream from some of the arguments in like the dialectic of enlightenment, where, this reads against mass culture. They're complex, but they are laments for certain kinds of standardization that are different from, say, the high culture of another era, however inaccessible it might have been to the workers of another era. There is that thing. And those in different ways are stories about one modernity or another. It seems to me like we had a period where there were readily identifiable cultural strata, and now we don't. And you can feel different things about that. You can have different stories about why it happened, but that's the important story to tell. High culture and lower culture, high culture and mass culture. But the story you're telling in these chapters is about higher and lower value congealing in certain kinds of objects. So it's not that a dinner party is mass culture or low culture, and that high cultural, that is to say, philosophically dignified language is used to describe it. And so your literary reading is to say the high and the low. James went to the theater, James liked vaudeville, that kind of reading, which is important and interesting and wonderful to know about. But it's not your reading. I think, especially the way you finished your remarks there, thinking about the occultation of different kinds of labor that even go into the support of wage labor to begin with, unvalorizable on purpose, so that certain kinds of labor could be valorizable and exploitative in the narrower sense. Like, that seems to me where the action is in so many readings. And so, like, am I crazy to think that like there's a difference between a literary reading that focuses on the conjoining of higher and lower forms of value from a kind of reading that, literary critics like me growing up in the 80s and 90s thought was like the Marxist reading, which is like the story of the gradual collapse, which blended with the postmodernism reading. Right? I mean, that's why Jameson uses the word flattening, flattening of affect. Like, so to be a Marxist literary critic was to say, like, this happened, a middle, it's like a huge middle because of productive power. But I don't think that's what you're doing. Am I off the mark?
Totally on the mark. It's funny because a lot of people do point that out as something about my work that they kind of like or something, which is nice, but it is kind of incidental. Like, it's not, the purpose is not to do a sweep to demonstrate, how, that one can move between those spheres of culture. And it's not really, that's not where the that's kind of incidental but accidental, that happens. Part of it has to do with just working on an aesthetic category which cuts across so many things. All of the ones in the other book did too, but this one all the more so because in a way it's really the aesthetic, correlative to the capitalist commodity itself. About which we never know, right? Because of the anarchy of markets, because of the basic way in which capitalist valorization works, we never ultimately know, right? Whether the value that is, that's something that will be realized or not. There's so many factors that enter in, and it's almost only something that we understand after the deed's been done, right? So yeah, and so I think it has to do partly with just the way this particular aesthetic form operates in culture, which is to say, inside everything as a kind of latent thing. But yeah, high-low isn't really the stake. And why is that? I think it's, one of the themes, as you point out, that runs throughout the book is this theme, not so much high, low, but labor and non-labor, or how the very concept of labor in capitalism entails non-labor as its shadow, right? And this happens in so many different ways. The occulted, reproductive labor of women is one place in which it happens. Another place in which we see this happening is in the production of surplus populations, a class of the permanently underemployed. So that is kind of the theme of the book. It starts off saying the gimmick, the judgment that gimmick indexes this an uncertainty about the labor contained in an object, or the value claims for an object that are linked in some ways to our suspicion about, it seems to be working, that's not working hard enough, it's working too much. But then that suspicion is I think indexing this other kind of insight about the way these two things are joined. So yeah, if there's a kind of governing dialectic in the book, it's definitely not high-low. You're absolutely right. It is something more like labor, non-labor. And so one of the interesting things, one of the reasons why the Stan Douglas, just if I can explain this without boring everybody, because it's actually kind of involved explanation, I'll try to be quick. But one of the reasons why the Stan Douglas piece was so interesting to me is, his artworks are very expensive to make. And even when the artworks are about a kind of shitty special effect and the gloriousness of that kind of shitty special effect, which is kind of what Suspiria is about. It's an homage in a way to the Argento film, which is supposedly one of the last films in the West, filmed in Technicolor. And this is my reading of that, of the Douglas. It's Douglas had gotten really, his name had gotten associated with his invention of this kind of algorithmic machine that he called his recombinatory machine. And it was just a machine for basically randomizing and combining and recombining two things, either a voice signal and an image signal, or a black and white signal and a color signal, but two signals that are brought in and out of sync with one another, kind of like the way the exchange of commodities works on the market, right? Either the exchange will happen or it won't, but it was like a syncing machine, basically. And the art critic Philip Monk actually has this great, he actually also has a really great reading of the work where he calls this the value machine. So I think this thing had happened where Douglas was making these works. They're all using the machine, and increasingly, like in the art in the David Zwirner like materials, like the curators always write like it's about the machine, which seem to generate like these sublime works of like enormous size. So when the work of art consists of a series of permutations or combinations of images, the total work in some ways cannot be viewed. It would take 11 years to fully view one of a Douglas video installation. And that description is always included in the description of the artwork. He'll always say viewing time, 6 months. And for Suspiria, the description said viewing time in forever. Now, I'm not good at, my math's not so great. So I don't know how, but I think there were just literally so many combinations involved with the different DVD machines that it would go on, Now, remember, this is a work about exchange. And so there seemed to be this like temptation to see the sublime work of postmodern installation art as a kind of like, testifying to the power of a value machine to endlessly produce value forever, And I feel like the only way to disrupt this kind of sublimity is the stupid gimmick. And so that's when we realized that the technique that Douglas actually used to produce this really uncanny special effect, which is basically what looks like Technicolor images projected on a gray background, where people are kind of fuzzy. It's kind of like you're watching the whole thing with 3D glasses, but there's no 3D movie. So you know how when you put on 3D glasses, everything is messy. Or no, when you're watching a 3D movie, you take the glasses off. That's what it looks like. Sorry. Outdated technology. I haven't been to one in like decades. But people think that what made this look the way it was the machine. It had nothing to do with the machine. It had to do with he simply swapped two cables. He exchanged like I can't remember now how this works, but there's like a certain cables for black and white signal and for color signal, and he just kind of swapped them. He reconfigured it. So that piece basically, I mean, you mentioned the sublime earlier, Chris, like what I like that piece is like it basically used the gimmick to defeat the sublime.
Yeah, I mean, along with labor and non-labor, which I really do think is the core, there is something interesting in your book. I mean, at one point you contrast what you call the silence of the sublime, like so austere, with what you call the garrulousness of the gimmick. And I feel like that's an interesting, not only is it conceptually interesting, but it feels like one of the more polemical parts of your book. Like you really want to get something across to your readers about either like the possibilities of interpretation that we, as you said earlier, how we're always practicing them, or ways to read art objects or literary objects where someone has reflected more deeply than we might realize, and maybe more deeply than they realize about questions of labor and non-labor. And there's something about the gimmicks everywhereness and its identifiability, because it's degraded a little bit, it's fallen out of place, there's a chink in its armor or something, that does feel different than the sublime. I will confess that I have tended to, and over the years, I've ended up feeling like the use of the sublime as a category in Marxist literary criticism, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like it keeps, I feel like it ends up always being an ode to the sheer productive power of capital to silence us. And so there's a really interesting comment and question that came to me in the chat, and I'll get to that in a second. But I guess, in terms of you and me chatting, I had kind of like one final question, and it is sort of like a theoretical question that emerges out of the things that you discovered as you were reading and noticing the continuities among all your cases. But it is about something like totality. Like we have tended to equate, maybe because of Jameson's important work, totality with the sublime, the more than we could ever imagine-ness of capital. But that's not necessarily the only way a Marxist looking at culture, looking at labor, looking at value production might want to think of totality. And part of what I, especially I was so glad you decided to take a little time to talk to us about the Suspiria example, because it is the place in the book where outmodedness is being leveraged. And there's something, I mean, in this, as I came up through queer studies, and so I was glad to, but I also had to think a little bit about the category of camp, like the deliberate deployment of the old thing, the cast off thing, the waste thing. So I don't want to meander here, because ultimately, I mean, I'd love to hear what you have to say about camp, of course. But the category that a lot of people maybe on this call or who have attended other talks at Red May would be thinking about in maybe other contexts like political economy or politics, whatever, like of totality. And how might we think about it using the gimmick besides using the sublime? That's kind of like my outro question for you. Like what are the like, if you were to write a next book that began there, like what would some of the possibilities be for you?
That's really good. Listening to you talk, it's really striking. You're right, the sublime, I mean, it's actually not, it matters that the sublime is the aesthetic category that has been most useful for talking about late capitalism in particular. We understand why, right? Because capitalism does have a sublime element, vast destructions of, wealth and crises, incredible amounts of waste, environmental damage, I mean, it is, right? But the sublime is by definition a kind of, it is literally a silencing experience, right? When you are struck by, terrible awe in the face of, any of those things I just named, I mean, you tend to just be dumbstruck. I mean, that's what it means to have that experience, right? And I think that's the reason why sublime has become a pure theory word, meaning it's a word, it's useful, but it's still an aesthetic word, but it's a word you really encounter only in print. Only in print, and when you encounter in print, it's like whatever, an art forum or in some of the stuff that academics write, and I use it all, when I use it too, and but to me, and that's not to say it's bad or something. It's just that it's worth noticing that this is not a word that is used in everyday conversations about the things that please and displease us. Conversations that are not just like, oh, I like this, you like this, but conversations that, because of the weirdness of aesthetic judgment as a very strange kind of speech act. A speech act that is ultimately always less about the object than about your relationship to other subjects, which accounts for all the strange demands we make when we make aesthetic judgments, this utterly presumptuous and illogical demand that everybody agree with us, which points to, suggests to us that there's something about aesthetic experience, as counterintuitive as it sounds, that is not private, that it's never private, it's never solitary. It can literally happen to you by yourself, but in some fundamental, deep structural way, these are outward facing experiences. And that they have something discursive about them too, right?
Yeah. The way you put that, you make me think of this thing that for me emerged over, I don't know, the last 10 or 15 years, but it's like it usually involves the experience, narrating your experience. Let's say, and you might be like a film critic of a certain kind of film, usually a franchise film with a very high, what you might call technical composition of capital, tons of special effects. It's the fifth in a series, whatever. And the thing is, like, I know it's bad. I'm not going to waste your time being the fancy film critic who tells you why it's bad because it's just so big. And I'm not going to be the asshole with a critique of the latest Avengers film. So I'm just going to like meet it on its own terms. And in some way, to me, that's like the productive sublime of capital forcing consent out of us, because nobody wants to be the jerk with the critique, right? So you just say, it's just so big. It's just so, there's just so much, and so you kind of like, there's like almost like a new recipe for getting your critical digs in en passant, while essentially making sure you have made, signal to your audience that you concede, like, yes, there's a lot here. And that ends up being this kind of funny, you don't say the word sublime, but it's like that's how it kind of creeps into a certain kind of like popular aesthetic judgment or something. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, there's this kind of reverence
Or
for
submission
and reverence.
Yeah, I don't know.
And that's why so the sublime makes everyone quiet by definition, and gimmicks are like that's okay. So the other thing about the gimmick that we haven't mentioned yet, but which is part of what makes it so interesting, is it'd be simpler if it was just a negative thing. It's also an attractive thing, right? It's attractive. So that's interesting. I mean, this is maybe where the camp stuff comes in, right? Camping, another, famously ambivalent aesthetic experience, that involves like recoding and stuff, and and making something that is excluding, like making like how to participate in culture that doesn't want you, right? There is so the gimmick is also attractive, and the fact that it is both repulsive and attractive also says a lot, and also makes the gimmick conducive to comedy in a way the sublime is not. Although there are a lot of examples in my book that are about where comedy and horror intersect. But no, Chris, it wasn't until you were talking that I actually realized something that, but that totality is reached, it goes back to the Adorno quote. You can totalize, you can reach the totality through a stupid gimmick. I mean, it doesn't, the mediation doesn't have to be a big thing. Even, like you can arrive at the complexity of the system and of capital simply by thinking a little bit about what it is you really mean when you call something a gimmick.
Yeah. There's so much to say there, like a non-cynical way of having seen it all, or seeing the all in every little thing. Because like the cynical reason, so to speak, would be like, I've seen this all before. You can't get one over on me. But then there's other ways of experiencing that allness. I mean, I think back to one of the things that you remind me is so special about, or interesting and compelling about that Rob Halperin book, is like the acute self-consciousness that, for the narrator, the speaker, to have sex with this particular soldier is also always this funny erotic grass is always greener, like you're also having sex in your mind with another soldier that you saw the day before, or whatever, like the kind of relay, or the absent presence in all our erotic attachments too. And that's a little bit of a totality feeling as well, which you could turn into a continuous experience of erotic disappointment, or which you could do something else with, which is kind of like etherealize the bodies you're with, and if you're into the right conditions, maybe enjoy that a little bit.
Lauren Berlant said to me, like, she's like, "There's a lot of sex in your book."
Yeah.
Yes, there is.
I know, that's a whole. Well, yeah. So I want to talk about that, but there's also now in this you might see it yourself, but there's some really great questions coming in on the YouTube chat, which, if you don't mind, like maybe I'll take. There's two right away, and then I see also that Joshua has a question, so maybe I'll render the two YouTubers for you, and then we can ask Joshua his question. But there's the first of those two from YouTube are what are the class dimensions of the gimmick? Are its origins as an aesthetic form constituted as a mediation of antagonism? Is the gimmick a cross-class phenomena? So that's the first question. Then I think related, but scaled up, a separate question is, have you seen a comparable concern with gimmickry in cultural production from or situated in the global South? So those are the two questions that have come in on the YouTube. And as I say, Josh also has something he'd like to ask you.
Those are super great questions. So the one about class, I do think the gimmick is crosses social classes in its use and its meaningfulness. Um, and this goes, but and I want to just say something about though about the gimmicks relationship to a hi. Okay. I'll just say something about the gimmicks relationship to class in another way that kind of gets at something that Chris was mentioning earlier about totality. Because there's a way in which, judgments of the gimmick can seem to be about invidious distinction, right? In the way that for Bourdieu, every aesthetic judgment is about invidious distinction. I don't think he's wrong about that, right? So my expressions of taste are always expressions of disgust at someone else's taste. And so there's a class component to all aesthetic distinction, right? And of course, and this is actually something very unique about the gimmick, when I see something as a gimmick, I am relying implicitly on the concept of someone for whom the gimmick is not a gimmick in order to experience it as a gimmick. I require this imaginary person who, unlike me, I'm not taken in by these false promises of saving time, saving value, or saving labor and expanding value, but somebody else is. And that's why I call it a gimmick. And I need to imagine this. And this is unique to the gimmick. I don't need to project an image or have an idea of someone who doesn't find, something cute in order for me to find it cute. But I do need this in the case of the gimmick. Now, one can read this two ways. You can read this as, well, this is a sign of like an expression of social superiority or cognitive superiority or something that is ultimately about class in the end. Look at those suckers, they're falling for this stupid thing, but I'm better and I don't. And okay, sure. But I actually think that I think it's reductive. I think there's much more going on here than snobbery. And the other way to look at it is that insofar as the gimmick always contains implicitly this image of somebody who dissents from you, who says, no, that's not a gimmick. That thing is actually really great, that in your judgment and your need to imagine this person, that you are tacitly acknowledging the social efficacy and power of this thing, regardless of what you think. You're acknowledging that it doesn't matter what you think, that this thing is actually not a gimmick for somebody else, and it needs to be that way for you to find it a gimmick. So that's a weird way of accessing something like the social totality, right? Because it's sort of like a weird displacement or delegation of the falling for the gimmick, which but which is kind of always invoking the others for whom what you're calling gimmick isn't. And maybe for them it's not a gimmick because because they have a disability, and so the stainless steel banana slicer, which seems so silly, actually is quite useful. I mean, but you always your judgment contains that other voice. So yeah, it could be snobbery and bringing us back to the class thing, but it also could be acknowledgement of the success of the gimmick socially. And then the global south question is super interesting too, because it's funny because like this is such a simple thing, but it's just useful to remind oneself every now and then that most of the world still is not, most of the work done in this world is not waged. Most labor is not waged labor, and particularly in the global south. So I can see how, insofar as the gimmick is also in some ways about, is about the wage labor, is about the labor capital relationship and about the wage in some ways. That the gimmick is about the wage as a form, that, there are places in the world where, that form, that social form, the wage, is not as prevalent as it is in, an advanced, deindustrializing, countries like the one we live in here, right? That said, we also know that the absence of the wage is something that dramatically shapes people's lives, right? And that the wage form and the wage relation impacts on those who are outside of it often more painfully than those who are conscripted in, right? So those are some of the questions or problems I think of when thinking about the gimmick in the global South. In terms of like actual empirical examples, I just don't know enough. I feel like it's still there only insofar as that wage, the labor capital relation, the wage labor capital relation does affect dialectically all that are kept outside of it for whatever, because of racism, because of empire, because of sexism or whatever, all the reasons why so many people around the globe are kept out of that relationship. It has a bearing on it too. So I imagine that it must come into play aesthetically somewhat as well.
And then that's really interesting. It's funny, I'm trying to think and write about this like amazing poem right now by a writer who I think is primarily a fiction writer, but they wrote this incredible poem. I'll put the link of it. The writer's name is Rube and the poem is called "Violence is a Shapeshifter." And it's just a really interesting example maybe of like, what would New York school poetry look like if the person writing it lived in Nairobi? And what is their relation to the kind of like consumption of mass culture, their sense of its fleetingness, pop song from 20 years ago. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out what to say about this poem, but I think it could be, and it looks like Joe in the chat also put another potentially interesting example. It's another quest to the archive, we could suddenly start to build that archive and think of like, what besides kind of American styles, weary irony would we cultivate in relation to the gimmicks that we see all around us. But so Joshua's popped on screen, and I know that he has a question for you. And I'm going to mute myself and let Joshua take it up.
Can I just say one thing too? The film Bakura, did you guys see that?
No.
Am I saying the name right? Is it Bakura?
I didn't see this film. Is it recent?
Yeah, it's. I won't say anything more about it. Just go watch it. You'll like it.
Okay.
Hi, Joshua.
Hi, Sianne. So I'm going to try and ask my question. I'll let it be a question for Chris too, since I rarely get a chance to talk to two such smart people at the same time. I'm going to start by mumbling about Google Glass for a second and then try and turn it into a question. I was sort of thinking back on that history and the account you give in the book. And the book is amazing, I just want to say. And anyone who's watching this who is somehow on the fence about reading this book, off the fence, read the book, amazing. That kind of Google Glass is, it locates it in the aesthetic, right? That it appears first as a fashion accessory, as you said, and it flops. And then it returns as a sort of stealthily as a labor maximizing device. But that's not quite my memory of what happened. And it sort of locates that in the realm of like judgment, right? Where people like have an aesthetic opinion about Google Glass and it fails. But I don't think that's why it failed, right? It was piloted in San Francisco. People immediately recognized that it was basically a police officer you wore on your face and a surveillance device. And there was a lot of like organized social pushback. People who showed up in bars in the Mission wearing Google Glass, right? It got ripped off their face and broken over and over again until Google pulled it out. So that's a different story of reception, right? Which is to say there's like organized social political activity that breaks the gimmick. So how does that become a question? Well, I guess the question is, right, that one of the accounts of the gimmick over the course of the book is the ways that it's like it's toward increasing productivity, right? It's the allegory of increased productivity, of the innovation that makes a higher productivity possible. And so I'm sort of wondering if the history of like attacking gimmicks like Google Glass is the same as, or at least adjacent to, the history of like machine breaking. Like, is the spinning jenny a gimmick, right? That sort of inaugurates a moment of the Industrial Revolution and gets, in response, two massive waves of machine breaking and capitalist pushback against that innovation. So I guess I just wanted to ask if two things. One, like, can we think of the spinning jenny and things like that in the category of the gimmick? And two, can we expand our sense of like reception of the gimmick, not just to judgment, but to like feeling intensely enough about it and what it's going to do to your life if it moves from allegory to reality, to want to destroy it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, that is part of the story. I find your question kind of cheers me up because it just makes me happy that you asked that question. So yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't separate. I know, like, as you know, I'm just very ambivalent about, aesthetics. The discourse is really conservative, and it's every time but I'm in it, and every time I'm in it, I have to like do all this work to try to get to a space that's not pulled down by all the, it's really is a very conservative like discourse, so aesthetic judgment ends up being this like reified, some people want to make it, right, like a kind of reified thing, like a kind of holy space, kind of special something, and it's actually not that way at all. And I mean, it's a spontaneous, what makes it different from any other kind of, let's just call it like a thought. Let's make it, what makes aesthetic different, judgments or evaluations or experiences, and I'm conflating these things, different from just other kinds of mental things that happen. This is what makes the whole thing scandalous when we like get so upset about, we feel very fiercely about our aesthetic pleasures, and feel that, people who don't agree with us are wrong, even though we know logically that's not true. They just might have a different, upbringing or whatever, or just different tastes. Is that they're grounded on nothing other than affect. So they are spontaneous and affective, right? That's the scandal of aesthetic judgment. The scandal is how can you possibly, move from something that is so, undeniably subjective. How can those experiences be about anything social, about anything objective, about anything historical? And how can you move even from those kinds of, thoughts to like conceptual thoughts? Like even that seems scandalous for some people, right? So to me, when you say like, was that like about like the wanting to kick the gimmick's ass, was that like, something different from aesthetic judgment? I would say it's a continuation of that judgment. And it is the expression of the judgment. And what's really interesting, and this is what, I kind of learned from reading Stanley Cavell, who, is not a Marxist, but he's really interesting on this, is like, for him, he takes very seriously the idea that the aesthetic judgment is a very peculiar and special kind of speech act. It's a speech act that's like the insult, like the compliment, like the apology, and like seduction, in that these are all things you can do with language, but they're not conventional. There's no conventional way to like insult somebody. And these are speech acts that, unlike the other speech acts that tend to dominate our memory of Austin's ordinary language philosophy, like, I bet you $5, or I sentence you to death, or I wed thee, or, I pronounce you man and wife, or whatever, that these kinds of speech acts don't name what they're doing. But there's this huge zone then of improvisation that goes on with this kind of speech act. So basically you can like insult someone compliment someone in like a million ways. And one way in which and aesthetic judgment belongs to this category of perlocutionary speech acts. And one way to make an aesthetic judgment about something as a gimmick is to like try to break it. I think. So if one like tries to step away from this kind of like icky idea of what an aesthetic judgment is, that unfortunately this discourse called aesthetics tends to produce, I think those lines separating the two things that you're describing is thin, actually, that we can move easily from one to the other.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joshua.
I want to pass it on to anyone else who has questions.
Yes, let's see. I'm going to scroll back up for 1 second. Well, it's funny. There was a comment in the in our chat that said it was about when you were talking about Henry James, and it said, "Well, you don't have to read this, but it's very interesting." And for me, it might weirdly loop back around to the question of machine breaking and wanting to rip Google Glass off someone's face in a bar in San Francisco, because it's a little bit about Kant and judgment making as a categorical thing, and that makes me think. The centrality of Kant to our sense of aesthetics, that is to say, we are people, when we make aesthetic, we have an aesthetic experience, we're making a judgment. And in making a judgment, we're weighing the legitimacy of different things. And that could work in different ways. It could be because we're using a faculty psychology and the imaginativeness of something versus its cunning or its calculativeness or whatever. Or just the judgment when you were early on in your comments saying, you know, there's an instability in the category of the gimmick because often it cashes out as a judgment about like, well, that took too much work or they didn't put enough work into that. You know, like what would somewhere be the like legitimate labor, the sweet spot of labor that would make the thing not a gimmick? Well, you know, Marx would tell us, well, that doesn't exist except as a social average, and then it would be invisible in a certain way. So this is not what the comment was about per se, but the writer of the comment says that your point about occulted labor in James makes the commenter thinking about a snarky comment that Rebecca West made about the sacred font. Her critique is about the excessive and inexpertly hidden labor on the part of the narrator. So your interlocutor quotes West saying that the narrator, quote, spends more intellectual force than Kant can have used on the critique of pure reason in an unsuccessful attempt to discover whether there exists between certain of his fellow party guests a relationship not more interesting among these vacuous people than it is among sparrows. So then it's like the category of like force and triviality, like so much effort for something that like, so the blame is actually like laid on the narrator, you know, for putting too much, not just reflecting and having interesting intuitions about value or higher, lower value or labor and non-labor, but succumbing to effortfulness in the name of trying to make what, like, you know, idle wealthy people seem more interesting than they actually are. I don't know. That's the critique. So I'll shut up there and just like let you meditate on that for a second.
Oh, thanks for pulling that one out, Chris. That's a great quotation. And yeah, the sacred font, of course, is in that chapter. And thanks to whoever it was who shared that. It's fantastic. I didn't know about the quote or the Kant reference, which is fantastic. But yeah, Chris, I don't know if you read that novel, but I mean, it's just unbearable, you know. But like, but then this narrator, he's obsessed with like trying to see if he can. He's trying to do something kind of like what we do in some ways. He's trying to analyze a pattern. You know, in the erotic relationships that are around him. He's one of the few male examples of the affective labor who has to, where there's something surreptitious about the labor itself. And he has to hide the fact from these, you know, guests at this like, you know, country house where they're all, you know, so, you know, spending the weekend, that he's doing this because he knows that it's obsessive and problematic and excessive, right? But yeah, I mean, to bring it back to Marx, I mean, the way in which the gimmick is constantly uniting the superfluous, the trivial, and the utterly necessary. I mean, so my book opens with like a couple of counts of, with an account of this paradox. And it might remind some of the audience members here of that famous quotation from the Grundrisse where Marx talks about the moving contradiction, right? The moving contradiction is, capital increasingly makes the superfluous. I'm going to butcher it. It makes the superfluous necessary for the necessary. Some superfluous becomes the ground of the necessary, right? And there's so many ways in which we see this happening in capitalism. Like one of which is like, there is no way for the worker paid a wage to produce the value equivalent to the price of that wage, right? Which is basically to meet the minimum requirements for, her renewal the renewal of her labor power. She can't do that minimal thing without making surplus value for the capitalists. One cannot do the minimal without producing the surplus, and therefore. One of the big surprises when you read Capital is like, wait a minute, all value is already surplus value. There's no such thing as pure value. It's always surplus value, right? So there's that's one way to think about this like painful paradox of the necessary and superfluous being joined at the hip, right, with capitalism. And another way in which you see it is that you need gimmicks to survive. So the book opens with some examples. One is from James Baldwin. One is from a really amazing queer African-American writer named Charles Stevenson Wright, who has totally fallen out of the canon, but who I really recommend. Zany, dark writer, dare I say, like kind of like even more interesting than Ishmael Reed, but kind of that same style, right? And the book that I read that I talk about of his, there aren't very many books by Charles Stevenson Wright, but it's a book called The Wage. The Wig. But I just blew my own punchline. It's called The Wig. It literally uses the word the gimmick. It's about a man, Lester Jefferson. He's chronically underemployed because of racism during the 60s, this moment of Johnsonian democracy and equality. And he's consistently underemployed. And he realizes that in order to get a stinking job, he needs a gimmick, he says. And his gimmick is he's got to change his hair. So he ends up looking less black. So the gimmick is the wig, and the wig is access to the wage. And the third example is that great scene from Gypsy, which I'm sure many of you know, the musical comedy where the three sex workers are basically singing about how, girl, you got to get a gimmick if you want to get ahead. All strippers are the same thing. You're going to need a tuba. You're going to need some kind of prop, right? So yeah, sorry, that's a riff though, Chris, on what you were saying about the trivial and the necessary. But for these people who are blocked, whose access to the wage is blocked, the gimmick is a survival strategy.
Oh gosh, I love that. There's really interesting questions coming in, so I want to make my own little observation, tiny and short. But I think this conversation is helping me see something. Like I was thinking, the way I think of this book about the gimmick being a culmination of a project is also like it's in like, to me, like a dialectical relation to your earlier books. So like when I read the title and when I read the book, Are Aesthetic Categories, I was thinking of you as like really culminating in that book, a Frankfurt School project, indebted a little bit, not always acknowledgedly, but to Zonratel, which is like, look, here's a political economy of thinking that reworks philosophy by saying like Kant's categories that seem to come from nowhere, they're just in our heads, actually emerge in tandem, so says Zonratel. And then I think, the Frankfurt School in one way or another embraced this, even though Horkheimer was cranky about it. We can tell the story of the history of philosophy in the last couple hundred years in accordance with the history of the rise of an exchange economy based around commodities. And so categories are actually fully social. They're not just intracognitive, they're fully social. And so I thought, what you're doing, Sianne, is like really taking this move to get aesthetic judgment out of that special holy space and say that it only can subsist if it's fully socialized in exchange, and really figuring out what that means. And that's something that I was really grateful for. But I also think that there's a way in which this recent book, because of the complex, somebody else somewhere else has to think something different than what I think, dynamic that it's a totality dynamic that I think of as being under the aegis of Hegel, actually, who in his own way takes Kant's categories and doesn't just do a Frankfurtian move and says, well, they were already always social, but does something else with them, which is to reincorporate them into a complex dynamic of elsewheres and otherhoods that can sound like voices in our head. One of the questions in here is about psychoanalysis and Freud. I'll get to that in a second. But also, I think brings us closer to the dynamics of value production than Kant ever could. I'm sorry, Zone Rachel, but I think of this most recent book. This is my big outro, because I'm going to shut up from here on after for the rest of our little session. This book is the most Hegelian of your books in a certain way, actually, because of the ways that elsewheres are always at work in a kind of totality that Kant wouldn't or couldn't think with. So that's my thing about this recent book. Was that?
It's kind of hug you through Zoom. Just because I think that's true. And I think and I haven't quite figured out why. I think that's oddly true. I think even though the kind of like, even though I lean a lot on Kant, and I put them together with Marx, which is already kind of odd combination, though I'm not the first to do that by any means. There's a lot of people the more I think about it, I do feel like I feel like aesthetic judgment as theorized by Kant it works so nicely with doing with Marxist thought in so many ways. So yeah, it's a great mediation, because it's always moving beyond what seems to be the most idiosyncratic and private thing to the most universal thing. That's what it is. That's what makes it outrageous and socially inconvenient sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But Hegel, I think you're so right, Chris, and I also recognize that, and I'm kind of still learning or trying to figure out like what is going on there, and I actually have been reading a lot of it. Well, I actually just been teaching, but before I was teaching, I was reading a lot of it. And what I like about Hegel, which is what I also like about Marx and also like about Jameson, is the way in which they all make us inhabit error. And this is a very risky thing to do, because whenever you like really inhabit an error, stay in the space of an error and kind of live that error and think in that error, the medium of that error, you make the error bigger. You make it phenomenologically bigger. You give it affective intensity. But still, this move of making us dwell in a kind of what we will realize, and with Hegel, you know what's coming, right? So you know that the thought you're in is wrong, but you're made to kind of like move through it and push through it and be in it. My thoughts on this aren't really pulled together yet, but it's similar to the way in which there's some places in Marx where Marx does the same thing. He will make you pull you into like the space of a kind of wrongful thought, and that's usually like not super wrong. It's like either some kind of common sense, or it's something that Ricardo thought. Ricardo was close in many ways, and then for a couple pages you're not even sure, because the way the writing is written, is this Marx ventriloquizing a kind of way of thinking about value that is ultimately going to be shown to be like totally like, stupid in the way that Marx likes to, make you also feel, but like, so why does he do that? And why is he sometimes so like, like I was going back to like this chapter in Capital, it's chapter like 9, like it's the one that's on seniors last hour. And there's this really weird thing that's happening like before like we get to the actual anecdote about seniors last hour, which is just openly sarcastic. It's obvious that this way of thinking is wrong. But right before that, there's a section where we kind of like do this exercise with him, and it's not really clear like if this exercise is like modeling how senior thinks, or but I think the reason for Marx doing this in any case, and my hunch is that the reason why it's important for us to affectively inhabit these errors, and in a way that's analogous to like the error of saying something is objectively beautiful. Like we know that's not true, but what's interesting is we can't not say that. We cannot, I mean, that's living in error. I mean, like, logically, there's nothing objective about, anything like about the gimmick or the, I mean, insofar as that it's, like something that's like literally inside the object, we, even from the simple fact that we know that like, we have different aesthetic judgments than, let's say, our parents, it's common sense. So, but when we have an aesthetic experience, we are in some weird way in an error, in some ways, and I think it's Marx is just trying to show us how difficult, just how we can't liberate ourselves from we live in a world where these wrong thoughts are produced because the world is wrong. The world is wrong. It's going to produce the wrong thinking, and you can't just think it, correct it with your better thought. And I think that's why we have to live it, or like, or be in the error and experience it, because it's almost teaching us, not that the world that produces this wrong thinking is intractable, but just, to understand like the enemy, as it were, to understand how entrenched these ways of thinking are. And you can't just magically, even if you're smart enough to figure out your way out, like in the phenomenology of spirit's going to make the same damn mistake all over again, and then come out the other end like a cartoon. So I don't know what's going on there with Hegel. It's probably too long a response to what you said, but I totally think that's true.
I think it's super interesting, and I could easily see Hegel hijacking this this conversation. There's a bunch I want to say. I mean, I'll say one tiny thing because it loops back to Joshua's thing, and then really and truly, there's all these great questions in the chat. But I mean, to me, one of the things in that dynamic that you're describing, in terms of the historian of philosophy John McCumber has this book called Understanding Hegel's Mature Critique of Kant, which I'm very fond of, and he talks a lot about how Hegel doesn't negate Kant, but thinks of himself as putting Kant's philosophy in its place by finding the place in which it should go. And that's something that Moishe Postone says about Marx's relationship with Hegel, that despite, letters to Engels in which, Marx congratulates himself for inverting Hegel, that the real relationship is that Marx puts Hegel in his place. Like there was no actuality. Hegel's observations in certain regards didn't have a place to go. Marx figures out where they belong and puts them in their place. And I think that sense of like, these thoughts are right until they're not, or they're only right in a highly specific and failed way, is a Hegelian way of thinking that Marx picks up from Hegel. And it allows us, unlike, I think, say, like a categorical imperative, to think about tendential movements and momentum, and tipping points. And to me, that's what happens when you're standing in a bar in San Francisco looking at that person with the Google Glass on. I don't think, I think what happens in your head isn't the categorical imperative, which is like, what if everybody's wearing those? Or the image of everybody wearing them isn't understandable best as a categorical imperative somehow, but you're thinking tendentially. Like, look, where is this going? That asshole is the thin end of the wedge. And there's very little thinking in the sort of like Western philosophical tradition that we're taught in grad school in snips and snatches that is about tendential movement. And so I think that might be another way to think the continuity that you were describing in your exchange with Joshua is like, what is the totality framework that allows us to think about tendencies and momentum? And how do we experience that in the vernacular? What's the tipping point there? So anyway, that was my like silent observation about your exchange together before. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think what you're saying is so interesting. Like tendency is just the concept of tendency.
Yeah.
It's the title of one of E. Sedgwick's books, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's the countervailing tendencies in capital.
Yes, right.
That's very important, but they're really under theorized.
Yeah, buoying up profitability. I mean, that's where I don't know, whatever. David Harvey's really interesting course, but like any person thinking about geopolitics, spatial fixes in a variety of ways, I think that the production of counter tendencies to keep profitability up is really interesting. But I'm going to hit you, if Red May says we're still allowed, and if you still have the energy, with a couple of these questions from the chat, and then we'll see where we are. I know we've been talking for a while, but so from the YouTubes question, when you say, I think maybe you and me earlier in the conversation, that the gimmick arose to overcome the sublime, this questioner can't help think of Freud and sublimation as a redirection. So maybe is there a way to think about sublimation? Second question from the YouTube chat. Instead of thinking of just the gimmick as manipulation or hoodwinking, a cognitive assault, should we think of the gimmick as a reprieve from totality, a will to be re-enchanted, like the desire to submit, like just kick back and enjoy it, like knowing very well, however. Those are two from social media. And then if we have time, I can... apparently Philip says we can talk forever. We'll see our human capacity to keep going. But those, I'll give you those two, and then we can maybe check in and see how things are going.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm not sure I have I don't know. I'm not sure if I have a
sublimation
to say about sublimation and its relationship to the sublime. So I'll put a pin in that one.
Okay.
And then maybe it'll come back. It sometimes does. And then the second question, can you remind me real quickly what that was?
I didn't read the full text of the first question, but can we think of that? So this is still back in sublimation. Can we think of the gimmick as short-circuiting the cost of reinvestment in cultures of capital, reproduction, the bliss of ignorance, or stupefied awe? I mean, I will say before I think, as a shorthand tonight, we've been saying the gimmick, but we mean two things. We mean the production of the gimmick as a version of the dynamics of the commodity, but we also mean people's identification of gimmicks as gimmicky. And we're saying the gimmick in both cases, so but of course there are two things that are opposed to each other. So I think the questioner is like, can we think of like the moment we critique the gimmick or recognize or name its gimmickiness as doing a short-circuiting the thing that's in another mood or another moment we submit to, perhaps knowingly. So that was the sublimation part. But the second one was, I think, a person finding interesting that, I mean, in some ways I read this second question as like, well, you're not just doing ideology critique. That's the other thing. I've wanted to take some time tonight saying like, hey, your Marxist literary criticism doesn't center itself on some of the things we got used to. High and low, collapsing in a postmodernized story of capitalist productive capacity, the sublime. Capitalism is unknowably powerful. But also, like a certain kind of ideology critique. How is that vernacular judgment? Like, that's bullshit. Different from ideology critique, which isn't exactly the question, but the second question says that they're hearing you doing something more complicated than just thinking of the gimmick as manipulation or hoodwinking or cognitive assault. So maybe it is a little bit about how are you doing something that's different, or how do you think of yourself as doing something different than ideology critique? Because it's not the only thing Marxist critiques have up their sleeve.
No, okay, super. And actually, I kind of get the two questions now, and actually thought they're kind of related in some ways, and in a way relate back to the ambivalence about gimmicks that we were talking about like earlier during our call, right? Which is like that we like them and we dislike them. And that there is also a kind of charm or even enchanting quality to gimmicks, right? There's this, one of the chapters in aesthetic theory, if you can call it a chapter, because for those of you who know this book by Adorno, there's like no chapters. I mean, it's just like a big block of text, basically, with some headers. But there is a section that is translated in English by, I think it's Hewlett Kentner, as enigmaticalness. Enigmaticalness, art's enigmaticalness. And I think the German word is like, it's like Rätselkeit or something like that. Rätsel is like a puzzle, and what's really striking there is when Adorno, the dude, is like talking about art's, what makes art a site for sublimation or enchantment or whatever, it's enigmatical character. He does not turn to great works of art. He doesn't discuss the sublime, although he loves that, right? He ends up talking about like children's chants and like and games and like an explicit opposition to like Wagner's The Ring. That's his own example. He's like, I'm not talking about The Ring. I'm talking about like crossword puzzles, and I always found that super interesting. And it gets at, the gimmick shows us something that I think, and now this is something that's in literary studies, hopefully contained there, but something that, post-critique, likes to kind of like gaslight us about, right? Which is that, we can find things that are charming. We can be charmed and fascinated by things even when we see through them. Which means that when, this goes weirdly back to the ideology critique, which means that analyzing something let's just say it, like, analyzing or unfolding its ideology for us to see, which is, not even necessarily an easy thing, doesn't kill your pleasure in the thing. At least not for me. To me, it always makes the aesthetic artifact way more interesting, and not only does it make it more like, not only does it make you kind of just simply know more about the object you're studying, it makes you see more, it makes you perceive more in the thing that you're studying, whether it's a poem or, so for example, like knowing, I could think of different examples here, but like, you end up like, it's not like knowledge doesn't kill your pleasure. I think that's common sense, but there's been so much like the kind of intellectual things that have been going on in the academy, particularly over the last 20 years, is kind of like gaslighting and just makes you, like forget that this basic fact. So I feel like the gimmick is a great place to think about some of these things, because it is much more like a children's chant or a crossword puzzle than Wagner's The Ring. But insofar as those kind of silly things can be the place where Adorno thinks we really see art's enigmatical character most clearly. Also in things like this, he talks about the circus act. And he talks about Thomas Mann's quotation that art is the highest form of prank, but the question of the circus is like, Adorno's like, why are you doing all that? Like, why are you jumping over this hoop? Like, what's all that about? Like, I mean, Jasper Burns, our friend, he has written a whole book about this, and other people have too. Like, the artwork is like the ultimate site, right, for the question of questionable labor, and the questions of value, like, and perhaps epitomized above all, and that infamous ready-made that's so old now, right, the toilet seat, Duchamp's. First, unassisted ready-made, right, is done to raise these questions, about the nature, the status of the kind of labor that goes into art, and the question of what is the relationship between productive labor and unproductive labor, which is again that dialectic that runs throughout the Gimmick book. It's a kind of version of the labor and non-labor question, right? Is productive labor versus unproductive labor. And the fact that our society increasingly depends more and more on this huge zone of unproductive labor in order for the productive labor to go on. Yeah, okay, now I'm just rambling, but I think those two questions were kind of about this, the charm side of the gimmick, actually, and the recognition of its pleasures, and the taking. And the thing that it reminds me of us also is that it's also pleasurable to make judgments. Like, that's a gimmick. Joshua might say it's pleasurable to rip off somebody's Google Glass, and there's an actual image, there's an actual moment in the book. Chris, you remember the chapter on that like terrible performance art piece in that novel by Nicola Barker? Basically, David Blaine, the US magician, he like starves himself in public. It's 2003 in a glass box that's hung over Potter's Field in London. This actually happened. And Nicola Barker decided, it was like a stunt that he did. It was sponsored by Sky Television. Was it art? But this is a gimmick. People hated this gimmick and they try to destroy this gimmick. They threw eggs at it. They but then there was all stuff like, was it anti-Semitic? And then Nicola Barker writes a novel that is kind of a stunt because she wrote it like in exactly the same, pretty much like around the clock, to coincide almost with the month of his performance. So she kind of writes a novel around the guy in the box, the gimmick, the suspended gimmick, right? And publishes it like that same year. But sorry, the point is that entire novel is all aesthetic judgments. That's the only thing that novel is people discussing their like, well, I like what do you think of this Comme des Garçons perfume? But mostly conversations about the gimmick. And you realize when you read that novel that fighting about, or in the right context, debating or discussing and analyzing gimmicks, detecting them in front of other people and debating, them is really pleasurable and sociable.
Yeah, I love that. I'll say one thing, and then I think the conversation leads nicely into a little cluster of questions asked by Joe Giardini in our Zoom chat, which I know folks on the YouTube don't have access to, but I'll try to paraphrase them. There is, of course, like an older school, much older school, maybe early 20th century Marxist literary criticism, which, would laboriously tell its readers what the ideological content was of or the ideological limitations of a work were. And that's now part of everybody's recipe, and sometimes we got to do that. But then, by the 80s, right, right when somebody like me is coming from undergrad to like grad school, there's a bit, we start to feel a shift in a dominant towards a cultural studies model, which kind of at root, at least when you're reading it at first, sort of wants to make an argument that, like, look, mass cultural products in particular, so subject to ideology critique, the sitcom, the action film, whatever, are not just tools of domination. They are possible tools of subversion because people like them, and regular people liking stuff is not just their stupidity. So in some ways, like, I'm not being fair, I'm cartooning cultural studies in that moment a little bit, but it does at some level just kind of invert and say that the bad thing is actually the good thing because regular folks like stuff. but I feel like, the rise of queer studies, for instance, helps us think about our lovely vulnerabilities. And of course, the capital that needs to produce commodities has had a couple centuries now to figure out every combination of violence and coercion in its recipes for extracting labor from people, and to create just the right degrees of waged unwaged labor as best it can. But also on the side of determining that we all need to be consumers, has spent all the time in the world studying every nook and cranny of our beautiful human vulnerabilities, what we like, what we laugh at, what we share together, what we gossip about, and weaponizes those and turns those into further opportunities to help us to consume. So rather than saying that the commodified object, the mass cultural object, is subversive because people like it, it is an index and a kind of like measure of the surface tension of capital's latest state of knowledge about our vulnerabilities, our mimetism. If somebody else likes something, I get interested. It knows us really well, and we can do with that what we will. But I think that's a little bit different than a model from, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Our tiny little human selves and our sociability. I say that just because Joe has asked a series of questions, which maybe I'll let them paraphrase. But one is about, the tiny little creatures in the Rube Goldberg devices at the beginning of your characterization of the book. Another is about like the small humans in James Boggs's story about the increasing superfluity of especially racialized laborers, Black laborers in particular, in deindustrializing capital. And then Joe also makes reference to recent work by Annie McClanahan on Amazon's use of the phrase "mechanical Turk" coming to us from Walter Benjamin for the really, can you even call it a wage, like this the paid but barely paid micro labor of scrubbing web results, all that stuff. The humans at the bottom of the machine, the little tiny humans at the bottom of the machine. And since your analysis of the gimmick, is so interesting in part for the way that it helps us see both of those things together, that occultation more clearly, maybe those questions are a nice way to round out our conversation. Joe, do you want to ask them kind of live? I hope I didn't mangle them. I saw a little bit of a through line in them, in a way that your questions were speaking back to the very beginning of our conversation about Rube Goldberg devices.
I have nothing more to add. I mean, as ever, I feel like, Chris, you took the thoughts and you articulated them as I wish I'd been able to. So please, Sianne.
I gotta say, Chris is really good at doing that. Thanks, Joe, for those questions. And I also saw the last one in the chat now on kitsch too, and marketing. I'm glad you mentioned James Boggs, because one of the things that I tried to do in the opening of the book is, so one of the reasons why I have those specific examples from Baldwin, from Charles Stevenson Wright, and from Gypsy, and there's another one which I owe to I got the lead from Jonathan Flatley, who points out in one of his articles on this documentary made in the 70s finally got the news. There's a Ken Cockrell, who was a Black auto worker and activist in Detroit, has this rant in that film where he's like, he talks about the credit gimmick. What I was looking for in those examples, and Boggs was another one of them, he was a minor one, is I wanted people who use the word. I wanted also some people who actually use the word, because even though, as I was talking to Joshua, and we we're saying there's so many ways to call something a gimmick, including throwing an egg at David Blaine or whatever, I think that's a version of that evaluation, that the word matters. And so I was looking for people who use the word, and Boggs uses the word several times. He explicitly says, and he talks about the gimmick of make work and government contracts and war work as gimmicks that are basically hiding the systematic kind of expulsion of labor for him due to automation in the and also racism in the Detroit auto industry. So I know Jason Smith has a book on automation, which I just finished reading, which is fantastic, that has a different take on automation than Bob's ultimately. But yeah, the gimmick is always pointing to the occulted living labor in the machine, and just like in the forgetting of the living creatures that are stuck in the Rube Goldberg. Your last question, Jill, I'll just say it. So you have a question about kitsch and marketing. And I do want to mention that because advertising is in some ways the ultimate gimmick. And this maybe goes back to Chris's stuff about periodizing ourselves, because yeah, the moment of cultural studies was also the moment where there's a lot of attention to advertising. And a lot of pressure put on the way people consume in general is somehow the key to understanding capitalism, which is not untrue, but it's funny because I feel like we're talking about how you and I were brought up intellectually, because I recognize all the things, I mean, for me, it was like the late 90s, but it was many of the same tendencies or whatever, or ways of thinking, and they're not wrong. And I learned a lot from them. Frankly, I did learn a lot from cultural studies, and but looking back, it's just interesting, isn't it, to take a step back and go, wow, why was there all this focus on bad consumers and this moralism about consumption with nobody focusing on production and the exploitation that goes on in production? Why did we get stuck for so many years? They're part of the same story, but it's so funny how, looking backwards, how rough critics were in their ideology critique, attacking consumption when consumption is not even the issue, really. I mean, it's and this incorporation of our desires and the way the gimmick knows what we want. That's why we hate it, because it's telling us it knows what we want, and we hate it not because it's wrong, but because it's right. It's often right,
I can take what you like and do something with it.
Yeah. I'll feed it right back to you. I mean, I actually click on I see my cookies tracked when I'm on websites, and I see an ad for the thing, and I actually will click on it. So, I mean, I'm the biggest sucker in some ways of this stuff. But I just want to say one quick thing about kitsch. So, I feel like it's a useful question to think about the gimmick in relation to kitsch, but Joe, as you probably know in the book, I take a moment to kind of talk about all the reasons why the gimmick is really not about kitsch, because kitsch is really not an aesthetic about production, and the gimmick is always the gimmick always hovers on the edge of being a gimmick and maybe just a useful tool, but the object of kitsch can never be a tool. You know what I mean? It's not used for anything. But the other reason why I kind of wanted to make clear that I'm not talking about kitsch when I talk about things like the gimmick or even the cute and the zany, although you could, it's just for the longest time, kitsch was this huge drawer, I feel like, a conceptual drawer that people just threw everything in that wasn't beauty or the sublime. It was just kitsch. It just became this huge, and it was dark in the drawer, and you couldn't see any of the things that are inside the drawer. And actually, when you open the drawer and just pull some of the things out that got put in there, they're actually kind of more interesting than the drawer. So that's just one reason to maybe focus less on kitsch, just because there's been so much said about it, and because it's really not the same thing, and because also it's become a term that has tended to kind of hide things, I think, more than reveal things. Not to say there aren't interesting books on kitsch. I think Daniel Tiffany wrote an incredibly interesting book on kitsch, in part because he talks about kitsch in poetry, right? But that's not really what I'm interested with the gimmick. It's something different.
There's a little comment in the sidebar that maybe is the perfect way to end, but do you see what Josh was mentioning here? It's not only kind of like our conceptual categories, but like a process of resistance to or objections to Marx demarxification. Your book is part of something interesting going on in the English Language Academy, what's left of it, around recovering the significance of Marx, naming, expanding it, new ways of using Marx's work. Maybe one last thing we could talk about for just a second is how you see yourself as part of that. You've made reference to work by people we know, some of whom are working in literary cultural studies, Jasper's work, or some of whom are working in a social science context, Jason Smith's work on automation. It feels good to be part of something, especially after I think Josh was exactly right. Like we grew up in the long shadow of a process of demarxification, whose contours and whose force we weren't necessarily aware of. But maybe that could be the last thing we think about. And your book works against that, I think, as part of a process of working against that, I hope. But maybe what do you think about that?
That's a great concluding question, Chris. It's really interesting. I think you had this experience too, because and Joshua too, probably. How do we become this? Because certainly it wasn't part of my
Training.
Was not part of my training. I had some great teachers, but they were not Marxists. When did we learn all this? I think back, because it wasn't in school, and actually it was with friends. I feel like I depend on as friends, and also reading other people. They're not that many. Happily, they're more and more. Actually, I think it's super exciting. I think it's a good moment. It's a bad moment economically, but it's a good moment for the work, and so it's inspiring. And then you find all these other people who it's also where do they come from? But they're there, and then they end up being your friends, and you read them, and you learn from them. So one of the best intellectual experiences I had was living in the Bay Area, having certain friends that where we just had reading groups. The Bay Area Public School was a group that I learned a lot from. Things like that. It's kind of heartening to realize that stuff like this can still happen outside the academy. And when it happens inside, it's awesome. But yeah, I appreciate this question very much. It's almost like a miracle.
Yeah, a little bit like Red May.
A lot like Red May.
Yeah. Well, Sianne, it's such a treat to get to talk with you about your work. And I found this year that I wasn't actually so much at the end of the day, like a Zoom hater. There's a lot about how dehumanizing it is, and I know, but Zoom and other platforms like it ended up bringing me back in touch with a lot of people this year. I got to go to more poetry readings. I got to hear a lot of talks at Red May. So I'm really grateful for this space that Philip, you, and the folks organizing Red May have created. And I sure hope that people out there, like Joshua said, are maybe even more ready to dive into the work that you've been doing, Sianne, than before. So thank you. This has been really great.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm sorry, I've got to give you another hug. Sorry.
Totally accepted.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks to Philip.
I'm reaching out to hug both of you there.
It's
this is hugging Joshua here. Yes, thank you, Sianne and Chris and everybody who contributed. And let's extend the network of friends, comrades, thinkers, and so forth beyond Red May. And as the university keeps chopping off vital parts of itself or consigning them to exile, how can one connect up all these kind of links that are just looking towards forming something else, the destituted university, if we can borrow Idris and Agamben's idea. So we'll leave on that thought. And thank you very much, everyone who watched this. And we now have only 2 events left for the month. We have neither vertical nor horizontal, the great clandestine event broadcast in the middle of the night sometime last week and unveiled for the first time for those people who are sleeping, which is most Americans as opposed to the rest of the world. And then on Wednesday, I got the time wrong. It's 6 p.m. in Mossman Park, the live event with Idris Robinson, Shimon Salem, Wendy Trevino, and either the real Joy James or the online Joy James. They're going to be talking about the George Floyd uprising at 6 p.m. We'll have the link for you. Give us some money, please. We're about 2/3 of the way there. www.redbayseattle.com. The value form, alas, alas. And onward we go. Back to our homes, our dinners, our loved ones, and our thoughts. So I bid you good night and look forward for the last 2 days.
Good night.